Hi and welcome to the next in a line of webinars that we at Irwin Mitchell have been putting on throughout the coronavirus lockdown, and we've been looking to talk about different things that have been affected by the lockdown and see how what we can do to help with those situations. This week, it is me, Lee Shapiro. I'm a partner in our residential property team in London, specialising in leasehold enfranchisement and lease extension work. And I'm joined together by Riccardo Corelli, who is director in the professional valuations team at Chesterton's. And we together are going to discuss the residential property market, the effect that the coronavirus has had on it, and where we are now, some 2 weeks or so after the housing market has been reopened by the government. Before we get onto that bit, I did have a couple of bits of housekeeping that I just wanted to mention. This is a recording of the event, and we will be sending that round to everyone to have a look at. So if we move on to the residential property market, clearly in the last couple of weeks we've been pushed into a new situation following the announcement at 10 o'clock in the evening on the 12th of May, telling us that the property market was going to be reopened the next day, and that the agents could start allowing viewings of properties and surveyors and valuers could get in to do the valuations. All of these had been stopped during the full lockdown. It was certainly a welcome surprise. I'm still slightly bemused that no one thought to tell the agents and the market that it was going to happen before 10 o'clock the night before. But nevertheless, this is where we are. And as you can see by the headlines on the screen, there's a lot of different thoughts, I suppose, about where the market is now. And that's why we've invited Riccardo to come along and join us, not only because he is a specialist enfranchisement professional valuer, but also because he has a feel for where the property market is now following the reopening, and we will go to him shortly for his view on where we are. What the government did on the 13th of May was to change the regulations which stops those viewings, to allow those viewings to happen. So we are now in this situation where this lockdown is relaxing, but it's still, as far as I'm aware, not relaxed completely. And there's still some valuers who aren't being allowed into properties as yet, or they haven't got through the backlog of work. But Rick will talk about that more. So we're going to talk about what's happened since it's reopened. We're also going to talk about a bit of the uncertainty and what you may want to do, or you may want to advise people to do during this uncertainty, and what we can suggest that you may want to do to increase the value of assets, to increase the marketabilities of properties, particularly the residential leasehold market. Part of the some of the suggestions we're looking at are whether you want to look at lease extensions, whether buying the freehold would help, whether there are any other issues that you want to resolve, such as ground rent issues or issues with the demise and what is actually within your lease, and whether there's anything else, such as making planning applications or physical changes to the property that would help. We'll also briefly mention at the end an update on the proposed changes to the whole leasehold structure. We can't really go through a webinar talking about leasehold law without those, I don't think. So that's enough for me to start with. I'm going to, excuse me, pass you on to Rick, who is going to be far more interesting about the state of the property market than me as a solicitor could be, because he's got a better handle on where we are on the figures. So Rick, say hello and over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's much appreciated. I think probably the first thing I ought to say is pick up on what you're saying about the surprise, because of the opening of the market. Because when I was asked to do this webinar about 4 weeks ago, it was a very different place to where we are now, and it was very doom and gloom, and nobody knew where they were going, when the doors would be open, and when we can carry on doing business. But all in all, there have been two schools of thoughts. One is that the global recession will lead to large house price crashes going into next year, and the other is that the UK property market will remain attractive, particularly from overseas investors, once the lockdown has been fully restricted with little impact on house values. But we've got to look at sort of the background to it all, and we've come out of, and we are still in, but we've got sort of historical, political and economical events that have had prolonged impact on the property market, and that really has led to a decline in transactions over the past few years. And the sort of the two main things that I would point to are the tax burden that's been put onto to homeowners and investors, and obviously Brexit. Now, when all that was cleared up towards the end of last year, the market certainly picked up in January, February, and the beginning of March. There's no question about that. We could all feel it in the market. The inquiries were up, the viewings were up, the property stock on the properties on the market had increased, and there was a lot of excitement within the agents. So things were happening. And then the dreaded coronavirus hit us, and we couldn't have almost been in a worse position. And the question is what's the impact, and where does that leave us? I mean, what we found was there were some transactions that fell apart, some transactions that were negotiated downwards, and some of them carried on at the same level. So there wasn't really a direct analysis of where we were at the time, and indeed where we are now. But I mean, what is interesting is looking at all market sectors are unstable, and what we have to do as value is to consider today the uncertainty. Well, what would somebody pay today for a property? And now it's very difficult to say what people would pay today, because the circumstances are different, and indeed there are different markets within markets. If we take Mayfair as an example, the top end of Mayfair may be more heavily hit than the more of the core market of Mayfair. So it is very difficult to have a broad brush percentage discount, and it's something that I've often been asked is, what's Chesterton's house view on it? And I've been told in very clear terms that Chesterton's hasn't formed a view on where the market's at the moment, and exactly where it's going to be heading to. The view that we've taken is that we would like to analyse all of the transactions that not only that we are doing or have been doing in the last few months, but also what other agents have been doing. But if we look at what Knight Frank have been saying, I mean, they've been perhaps the most bullish of all of the agents in central London. They think that prices will remain steady despite the hiatus that we're sort of experiencing, before roaring ahead 8% next year. And Savills are perhaps less optimistic. They're saying that there's sort of a short-term price drop of about 5 to 10%, but that the market will pick up again next year. But of course, they're agents. If we look on the other side of it, well, we've got buying agents, so selling agents and buying agents, and there's a high-end buying agency called Black Brick, and they have said that none of their applicants would be willing to proceed at levels that they were looking at buying pre COVID-19. So there's sort of a difference between the selling agents and the buying agents, which you would expect. But rather interestingly, on Monday, Rightmove published their record-breaking numbers of viewers to their website, which in one hand could show an indication of keenness to move forward. I think there's a real appetite generally amongst people that I speak to, of people just wanting to move on with their lives once this is over, and perhaps have reassessed their needs for their homes and investments. So I think there will be a lot of activity, but we have to be cautious with Rightmove because, of course, most of us are working from home, furloughed. We're spending a lot more time at home, and we have more time to spare in some cases. So we will be looking at perhaps Rightmove more often than we would ordinarily. So I think there is a bit of an air of caution with that publication. But I think overall there's definitely an advantage to lessees, because as a valuer, if there was the comparables that took place before the lockdown, they really are less reliable, because we're in a very different world. And I think what we have, it's undoubtedly that we will be more cautious, and we will add some sort of a discount to what was being paid beforehand. But I say it's an advantage, and there's the window of opportunity, because if Rightmove is right, and there's more demand that's going to be coming to the market as soon as it's opened up, then once those transactions go through, we would have missed that uncertainty. There will be certainty. It may be, it may not be, but it may be that the prices will carry on, as Knight Frank have said, and remain steady. And in which case, if you want to make an application, for instance, to extend your lease or buy your freehold, you need to do it now before those transactions take place. I've got two examples from our sales offices where prices that were agreed pre the lockdown, the buyers came back and they tried to renegotiate the prices down. The vendors said no. They relaunched those two properties to the market, and within a week got 100% and 96% of the asking price. So that uncertainty mixed with what Rightmove are saying, the demand still is there. My own view is that I think really, if somebody wants to take advantage of it, so perhaps if you're looking to sell right now, you might pause a little bit, but if you're looking to extend your lease and take the benefit of the uncertainty, now is the right time to do it in the market. So it's definitely an advantage to the lessees. I think I'm passing it back over to you, Lee.
Thanks, Rick. So if we move on, I think that takes us on to the different things that we can do in this market to assist with the position from the leaseholder's point of view, but it's also important to understand, I suppose, from any landlord what their leaseholders may be looking to do and why, because that may form how they deal with any matter that they receive. But what you're saying is, because of the uncertainty, that could have because when you do the valuation for the lease extensions or an enfranchisement, which we'll come on to discuss a little bit more, you look at the date at which the notice is served to start off the process. So if there is uncertainty there, and the leaseholders can say that the value is slightly lower at that point, then that will have a knock-on effect in the overall price that leaseholders pay for the lease extension or for buying the freehold. Rick, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that later, but that's my understanding of it. So if that's one of the things that you could do, and it is a good time to do it, I think what we need to do is look in a little bit more detail as to whether this is right in different circumstances. This will obviously only be right if the person that is looking to sell qualifies to be able to use this right and to make such a claim. So as we've said, the first of these is the lease extension. It may be if your lease is getting short, and what we mean by getting short can vary. It partly depends on what mortgage companies will loan on. Sometimes they won't loan on leases that are shorter than 50 or 60 years, but sometimes they won't loan on leases where they're less than 90 years. It will completely depend on the mortgage company. However, there is one thing that is certain at the moment, and that point is that once the lease drops below 80 years, there's an extra element that's payable in the under the valuation process called marriage value. And again, I'm going to leave all that to Rick to talk more about the valuation. But what you want to make sure is that you certainly don't let your lease drop below that 80-year mark, because that's certainly a point at which any buyer is going to query the length of the lease. And indeed, they will probably want it at least 82, 83 years, because once if they were to take the lease from you and you hadn't started off a lease extension claim, then they wouldn't be able to apply for a lease extension for 2 years. And I'll come on to that in a second. So I would say certainly if your lease is anywhere below 85 years, and you would certainly want to look at increasing the length of your lease, if you are able to do so. So who can apply? Firstly, you need to be a long leaseholder, and by that I mean a leaseholder that owns a lease that was more than 21 years in length when it was originally granted, and you also have to be the registered owner of it for more than 2 years before you can make a claim. That's why I'm saying that if you've got an 82-year lease, the 80-year point is more important for the buyers, because they wouldn't necessarily have been the registered owner of it for 2 years before the lease drops below 80 if you don't start the claim off for them. You also have to be careful with any remortgaging, because that can affect the how it shows as a registered owner, particularly if you're changing it from 2 to 1 person or 1 to 2 people, for example. If you are a qualifying tenant, then you do have a right to make a statutory claim against the freehold owner, or against anyone that has long enough on their title if they're not a freeholder but has a superior leasehold title, and that they have at least 90 years reversion, as we say, so 90 years longer than the end of your current lease. Then you're entitled to make a claim for a lease extension, and they have to grant you the lease extension of an extra 90 years and reduce the rent to a peppercorn. And by that I mean, people often say, what do you mean by a peppercorn? I mean literally a peppercorn. So in effect, nil. The other terms of your lease should otherwise substantially stay the same, save for some provisions that can be changed according to the statute, particularly if there's a defect in the lease. So this is one of the ways that you can clearly increase value, because people are much happier buying a lease that is sufficiently long that no mortgage company is going to have an issue with it, and you're not going to have an issue with selling. It will also deal with any ground rent issue, because we'll come on to ground rents later, but that can be a significant issue for some people, particularly in the current market, where there's been a load of issues about ground rent being raised, particularly by the media, as well as the government looking to change some ground rent points anyway. There is a process to follow if you're following the statutory route. That involves normally seeking advice from a valuer such as Rick, as well as solicitors, and what you need to do is get an idea of the cost of that lease extension. You then, the solicitor for you would then prepare and serve a statutory notice complying with all the pieces of legislation, and serve it on the freehold owner or the person that can grant you the extended 90-year lease. They then have just over 2 months to respond. They can ask for a deposit from you, and they can also ask for access to your property in order for their valuer to prepare a valuation. In your notice, you would have put an offer price, and the landlord in theirs will put in a counter offer price. Once they've served their counter notice, the parties can get together and negotiate the price, and that's normally what the valuers would do, and can negotiate the terms of the lease, which is normally what the solicitors would do. And once you can reach agreement on that, you can proceed to complete the matter. If you can't reach an agreement, then there is also a provision to go to a tribunal for the tribunal to do that for you. So if you start down that process, there is certainty if you have the right to make such a claim, and if you follow the timetables and avoid all the pitfalls in the legislation, you will get to a lease extended lease by the end. We would normally expect it to take 6 to 12 months, but it can be faster than that, and it does give you certainty. But you can also, if you start off that process, assign that process to any buyer. So even if you, and that will also help with the marketability, even if you haven't quite completed the lease extension by the time you've agreed a sale. So it's certainly something to look at if your lease is getting short, to start the process as soon as possible, not just to complete it for your own sake, but if you may find a buyer in the meantime, it won't stop you from selling, and it should help with that as well. There is another way of doing it, and you can reach an agreement in a relatively straightforward way with your landlord if they're prepared to do so, and if they are prepared to do so, you just need to make sure that the deal you're getting is a good one. So one thing we are always then asked is, what will it cost to do that, and what is involved? Now, the only cost I will talk about, and then I'm going to pass back to Rick, is that you do obviously have your legal and valuation costs that become payable, but the landlord will also have their legal and valuation costs. And as a leaseholder who is starting the claim and they are going to gain from extending their lease, they will do have an obligation to pay the reasonable legal and valuation fees of any landlord, apart from if you go to the tribunal, in which case, in the main, each party bears their own costs. So, Rick, let me pass back to you to talk about what it's likely to cost, and if you can give people a rough idea on that.
Yeah, no, thank you, thanks. I mean, I think what I would say is, you know, when people say, well, how do you do it? What are you doing? What are you looking to do in your valuations? I think the simplest way to say what we do is that we look to compensate the freeholder for their loss, and their loss is in their reversion, i.e. when the lease is due to expire, and in the level of the ground rent that they receive. So they're the two main bits. Now, if your lease falls below 80 years, then you also have the marriage value. So there are potentially three components that we need to look at. So it's the reversion, so what would an investor pay today to get your flat back in X years time. We have to value the ground rent that the freeholder would, or head leaseholder would have already received, and then marriage value if it's below 80 years. Now, marriage value just is a valuation that just looks at profit that's arised at by the granting of the lease extension. Now, to try and keep it simple, what I've got here and we've put on this slide is a table. Now, this table it shows the percentage that you are likely to pay given any term left on the year. So if we look at 65 years left on your lease, so if you've got 65 years left, you'll be looking at paying 10% of the extended lease value of the property. If you've got 25 years, you're looking at paying around 41%. Now, it's not an exact science. It's very much an indication and shouldn't be used as a form of valuation. Shouldn't be used to be relied upon. Each case is on its own merits. Each lease can be very, very different. The ground rents can be different. The clauses can be very different. And these things can have an impact on value, but and by all means, you know, if you wanted to give me a call and we can talk through perhaps in more detail and have a look at what you might expect to pay before you instruct a formal valuation. So that's really how the valuation is done. In terms of what it adds to the property, I mean, in a true sense, nobody really knows what it adds, because you're unable to sell the short lease and then sell the long lease. But what we do as valuers and the agents, they would say, if they're selling a short lease, they would provide the value of the extended lease. We would say how much it's going to cost to extend the lease, and then they would take the likely premium that you pay away from the likely extended lease value, and that gets to your short lease. But actually, in the real world, if I was buying a property, I would not accept paying the exact difference, and I don't think buyers do. I think that's perhaps how valuers look at it. That's perhaps how it's there. But when you're starting the process, there's a lot of risk, there's a lot of uncertainty, or there's perceived risk and uncertainty, and you would want to add a bit of a discount to allow for that, and also the hassle of going through it, because it's never so straightforward, and it takes up your time. So you want to be to see that in the price of the short lease, and I'm certain that is what happens. So there is definitely a profit to be made. It's not a substantial profit, but there is a profit to be made, and you know, some of us say it's anywhere between sort of 5 and 10%, something in that sort of order. So if you have the means to do it, then do it. And actually, if we're looking at it today, if you do it today, because of the uncertainty, the key is serving the notice, because once you've served the notice, you fix the valuation date. date, and that freezes everything. So the negotiations are focused on the value at that date. So it's quite clear that the uncertainty is at its highest at the moment before the markets really flow. So we can really play on that in terms of getting that premium down now, and then when the prices come back, you will get the benefit of that extended lease value increase in the market movement. So I think I'm going to pass you over to Lee now, who's going to just talk about the collective enfranchisement, which is another option that you may have as a leaseholder.
Thanks, Rick. Before I move on, I was just going to add, I think there's also a value to sorting out a lease so that you can avoid as many issues as possible going through any conveyancing process, because I certainly know that one of the things that is the most frustrating and when you're going through the conveyancing process is all the different queries and questions that come up, and if there's any issue on the length of lease or ground rent, then I'm pretty certain it should be any conveyancer on the other side who's worth their salt will certainly flag that as an issue and look to get it resolved. So if you can resolve that before you get into that process, then certainly all the better from my point of view, probably hopefully from your point of view too. We'll just move on to, as Rick said, one of the other options you can do is look at buying the freehold of your building. Now, this may or may not be an option for you depending on the type of building that you live in, but so if we just go back for 1 second, the lease extension is certainly something that you deal with on your own, and you don't need to involve anyone else. Whereas with the freehold freehold enfranchisement or collective acquisition, you need to involve any other qualifying leaseholders that may live in your building, because what the enfranchisement is buying the freehold of a building in which you own a flat, and you will only be able to do that if your neighbours will work with you on it. So it's not necessarily as easy to get off the ground, but it is certainly something that is worth looking at. As Rick was saying, that there's increased value of people, or perceived value of people who've got extended leases. There's also, my understanding is from agents that I've spoken to, there is a perceived increase in value, even if there's not necessarily a huge real value in owning the share of your freehold. People like to know that they are buying a share in the freehold because it gives them the greater say in how the building is run. So if this is something that you're interested in, the first thing you have to do is decide that you are prepared to take on the obligations of being the freeholder and to have your say in running the building. And you have to be happy to do that with your neighbours. If you're concerned by your neighbours, or you don't particularly get on, this may not be the right option for you, but it is something nevertheless we're going to explore, as it does work for a great number of people. If it is going to work, you need to look at the building and see whether that qualifies. It has to be a self-contained building, and it applies to those buildings containing 2 or more flats. 2/3 of the flats in the building must be sold to qualifying leaseholders. That's very similar to the qualifying criteria for the lease extension that we've talked about. So leaseholders who own leases of more than 21 years is the starter point. You don't, in this case, have to have owned the flat for 2 years, or the lease for 2 years. That's a difference from the lease extension provision. But if you own 3 or more flats in the building, you won't be considered to be the qualifying tenant of any. So you do need to bear that in mind if you're someone who has been buying up a number of flats in a building, or if you're a landlord and you're served a notice, you do need to check who is making that claim and whether they are qualifying tenants or not. If the leaseholders do want to make a claim, at least 50% of the flat owners must participate in that claim. And that's the total number of flat owners, not just the qualifying tenants. It just means if you have 6 flats in the building, if 5 of them are qualifying flat owners, you still need 3. It probably would work anyway, but you still need 50% of the 6 rather than the 5. I would say here, I should add here, we act for both leaseholders and landlords. So when we are looking at these claims, when we are making these claims, we are also looking at it from how a landlord would look at it. And it is really important to make sure that the leaseholders are getting good advice on these and are serving the notices correctly, because otherwise, as a landlord, or if we were acting for a landlord, we would very much advise them not to necessarily accept the claim, if depending on what if that works for them, because it may be that later on they may be able to get a higher price by way of compensation. So we'd have to look at the market, and they'd have to look at the market as well. But I just thought I would flag that landlords and leaseholders will look at these in a different way. In terms of what you would get if you were going to buy the freehold, you would acquire, as I said, the freehold of the building. Your lease would normally stay in place, but as a leaseholder, what you would usually expect to do is extend your lease to normally 999 years and reduce any rent that you pay to a peppercorn. This is what people sometimes known as the virtual freehold. It's not a freehold. You own your lease, but you also own a share, therefore a say in the way the freehold is run. But as I said at the beginning, you need to remember that that does bring with it obligations, and that you do have obligations to make sure that the building runs properly, and that you're working together with any of your neighbours to make sure that it does that. And you can only follow, basically you then follow the leases as the rules for the building. In terms of the process that's involved, it's very similar to the lease extension process. So again, you take valuation advice as to the price to offer your freeholder, your landlord, for the freehold. They would do their checks, and they would send their valuer in to do their own valuation. They would also then serve their counter notice, again, not around about 2 months after you've served your notice of claim, starting the process. Assuming they've accepted your right to buy the freehold, the parties would then negotiate the price and would negotiate the terms of the transfer. In that transfer, you can also include other property that you use with the flat. So if the leases also demise parking spaces or garages or the gardens, or you can use the gardens in common with others, then that would also get included within the freehold. It's something that you need to take advice on, and it's a little bit tricky to always define completely, but it's something that we look at and can advise you on. So if we move to the next slide, we'll see that we're going to pass over to Rick for him to look at again the issue of cost, what it adds to the property, and some of the other niche points that are raised by enfranchisement claims.
Thank you. So as been touched upon, if you have a flat in a block, you can share the freehold. In terms of, again, for me, the most prevalent question is how much is it going to cost. What the table that was provided previously is effectively, it's the same sort of valuation in a straightforward claim where everybody's participating and there's no development potential. And there's no other sort of interesting angles that the freehold could argue, but you would pay marginally a little bit more because you're going from an extended 19-year lease to a share freehold and a 999-year lease, and that is probably an uplift of 1 or 2%, which is also what we would say would be the increase in the market value of the flat over a lease extension. Save for a few years ago, I carried out some research with all of our agents and asked how much do you think it's going to add, the difference between, say, a 125-year lease and a share freehold and a 999-year lease. And depending on the location, it varied from no difference at all up to 8%. But it's undoubtedly, in my mind, that if you have a share freehold and a 999-year lease, it's worth more than a straightforward lease extension. One of the reasons is that people they have that extra long lease. They have the ground rent when it goes down to 0, I suppose it does in the lease extension. You have the leaseholders can have the right to put right any deficits that are in the lease, or defects rather. And you have control over the building. A lot of claims are made because of the freeholders' lack of control of repairs to the building, and as well as an investment side of it. But it certainly is more attractive to have a share freehold on a 999-year lease. One of the main differences, and where you may have to look at spending more is where there are non-participating flats, where there's development potential, and things such as storerooms and the like. But going on to non-participating flats, what I found over the years, leaseholders initially come to me and say, oh, you know, we explored trying to buy the freehold, but not everybody was interested, and we couldn't afford to pay for those that were not participating. And on a few occasions, I've been able to go back to them and say, well, actually, no, you can still buy the freehold, pay for your own bit, as you would ordinarily if everybody was participating, and we can get an investor to come in, and it would be a silent investor who doesn't get involved in the management of the building, and they would buy the investment, they would buy effectively the 999-year lease on those non-participating flats, and that then helps the lessees in the building get together and buy the freehold. And I've done many of those over the years, and I know many white knights that are knocking on the door daily asking. The other thing is development potential. There was one where it was a clear development potential. They didn't get on with their freeholder. The freeholder wanted to develop the roof. They knew that they were going to get planning to do so. So what they decided to do was to buy the freehold, and we brought in a developer who would pay for the development potential, and the developer would then do the development, but on the terms set out by the lessees. So they had complete control over the development on the roof space in those instances. So there are many reasons why people buy the freehold, but if you can get together, I think you should get together and buy that freehold. So I think we'll be looking now at exploring on the houses. So there are some houses that have leases, so not always freehold, but Lee will talk about that.
Thanks again, Rick. So yeah, so far we've talked about flats, leasehold flats, but you know, people listening may have a leasehold house. There's certainly a significant number around the country, particularly more to the north of the country, and also the original sort of landed estates in and around central London. So there are options for those leaseholders of houses as well. One of those really, or the main one really, is to buy the freehold of that house. You obviously don't need to involve your neighbours because you'll be looking at buying the freehold of just the house. You have to again make sure that you and your house qualify. By that I mean you have to check whether the building is considered to be a house. As we always say with this, it's amazing what can be considered a house, and there are so many examples of different properties that are considered a house, and in fact the Supreme Court and the House of Lords before them have considered this on at least 6 occasions. So it's not as straightforward a question as you may think it should be, but the definition is basically that the property must be designed and adapted for the use as a house, and it must be a house reasonably so called. It can include sometimes a shop below, a shop where the position where there's a shop with a flat above, and that may well be considered a house. What you need to avoid is though any house where there is any other property above or below it. So if there was a car park, for example, running underneath your house, and your house was in fact built on like a plinth, that may not be considered to be a house, even though it may for everyone else can look like it is one. However, if it's not a house, then you may well apply under the flat point for lease extensions. Anyway, so who can qualify? In the same way as with the flats, you need to be a long leaseholder. So that's someone whose lease is more than 21 years when it was originally granted. And again, in this case, you would need to have owned the property for more than 2 years. There are a few exemptions to this, but this isn't really the time to go through that. But it is something that you would need to be advised on if your landlord is one of the exempt landlords. And what you would get at the end is you would be able to acquire the freehold of your house and take over the running and the obligations. However, you do have to be careful that what you are taking when you have that get that transfer, that one, you're paying the right price for it, and two, that the current freeholder does not impose too onerous obligations on you when you take that transfer. However, if they are retaining neighbouring land or neighbouring property, they may want to put restrictions on how you use the property and what the property looks like. So don't expect necessarily a completely clear, straightforward transfer. But again, that's something that you would be taking advice on. So that's, from my point of view, just one of the other examples. Again, with the process, it's also very similar to the to that of the flat. There is a different statutory process, though. It's under a different piece of legislation, but it's a similar process. So you prepare a prescribed form in this case, having taken that valuation advice. That is served on the landlord, and the landlord would need to respond. The time limits in this process aren't as stringent as with the flat leases, but normally they would respond within about 2 months. Assuming they've accepted your right to buy the freehold of your house, then again, the valuers would normally negotiate the price, and the solicitors would normally negotiate the transfer. It's very much a partnership for all these matters between solicitors and valuers and their clients to help them through the process. Rick, I'm going to go back to you on the cost. It is a different valuation method, but it's similar results. So I'm going to pass back to you for that.
Okay. Great, thank you. Yeah, I mean, buying your freehold, the process is broadly the same as Lee says, but I mean, in terms of valuation, there are 3 different valuation bases, and 2 of them are broadly the same as the lease extension valuation. So you're looking at the calculation of the ground rent and the reversion and marriage value, and then there's another one that's slightly different that comes out with, well, quite different. Comes out with a much lower value, but I won't go into all of the details related. But it all depends on the rateable value limits, whether you're within or out of London. I mean, the main buy freeholds. So I mean, this is the final, the ultimate one that you can have. So freehold house is when your house, you would ordinarily expect to have a freehold. Don't come with freeholds, and this is your opportunity. Rather you have that. So it's without doubt another one of those tick boxes in terms of the conveyancing, in terms of value.
Rick,
but when it comes to it.
Rick, sorry, can I just stop you? Can I ask you to go back to the beginning of the explanation of the different processes, because I think you cut out across that bit, and I just want to make sure that we have got it. Apologies for cutting in.
Yes, no, that's fine. So there are 3 different valuation bases. There are 2 of them are broadly the same as lease extension, and there's one that's quite different, and it comes out with a much lower premium that's payable, and it all gets determined on, or the valuation is determined on the rateable value limits that were in place, and whether you're within and without of London. So that there are ways in which we have to determine the valuation bases, which not so straightforward actually, but we get there and we can work out what they are, and then once we're there, we can do that valuation for you. In terms of what does it add to a property, probably has a bigger impact than a share freehold or a lease extension, because it's the ultimate ownership. And most people who have houses across the country expect to have a freehold. So if you have a lease on the property that's a house, it really is viewed differently to having a lease on a flat, because you expect a lease on a flat, and even when you do have your share freehold, you will still end up with a lease on your flat. So a house is the ultimate ownership in terms of residential property. To get that freehold is really one of those extra tick boxes, because it always comes down to the conveyancing stages, and I think Lee touched on that earlier. The less hoops you have to jump, the more marketable your property becomes. People don't like short leases. There are more options to have extended leases, share freehold, or a freehold of a house. And those, when I started doing this 17 years ago, there was very much it was very much swung one way. There were more short leases on the market, but as time has passed, and everyone has been active in the market extending their leases, it's certainly switched, and there's less of a choice now. The choice is having your long lease, and that's what people expect to have, and your share of freehold and freehold. So yeah, there's definitely an uptake in terms of attractiveness in the market. So I'll pass that back over to you now, Lee.
Thanks. I think those are the three sort of statutory processes where people may want to look to see what they can change and that they have a statutory right to do. So you've got the lease extension of flats, buying the freehold of a block of flats, and also buying the freehold of your house. There is a right to buy a lease extension of your house, but I have to say I wouldn't normally advise doing it, because all you get is a 50-year extension, and you although you don't have to pay a premium for it, you end up paying what's in effect a market rent at the end of those 50 years. So you'd normally have the right to buy the freehold, and for the reasons we've already discussed, I would definitely suggest that, but I thought I should at least mention that it is an issue and why we tend not to look at it as a particularly favourable option. What I wanted to go on to now is how else you can increase the marketability of your flat, but where you don't have necessarily a statutory right to do that. Some of these may be significantly faster to deal with, but generally will require you and your landlord or your freeholder to reach agreement in order to sort them out. The first of these has really been in the press a lot, and a lot of people are now aware of this, significantly more than they were even 5-10 years ago, and that's the ground rent that is payable under the leases. Every leases, when they're issued, may well have what we call a peppercorn rent in, i.e. nothing, but most of them will have at least some kind of rent in there that will review and increase over the length of the lease. Now that's fine when it's a relatively nominal rent, but at some point some of the developers particularly with the leasehold houses, started putting in, but also with some of the flats, putting in these rapidly increasing ground rents that are now considered to be onerous, and people weren't necessarily checking them all properly when they were buying their properties. That's led to some significantly difficult leases in the market, where the ground rents rapidly increase to tens, if not hundreds of thousands of pounds over the length of the lease. And that really affects the saleability and marketability of that lease and of that property. So it's something to get resolved as soon as possible. Now, there are developers that granted these leases that have recognised that that wasn't the right thing to do. And for example, Taylor Wimpey put away a pot of money to compensate people and to rectify these difficult leases. However, not all of the developers have done that, and some of these leases have been sold on already. The freeholds of them have been sold on to third parties, so the original developers may not be able to resolve that issue now anyway. Where people have bought these leases, they really do need to resolve the issue as quickly as they can, and now is as good a time as any, for the reasons that we were talking about with the market and that uncertainty, because it may well be slightly more beneficial to do so now than in a higher market, or at least a certain market. But one thing I just want to touch on is, and I'm seeing increasing questions about ground rents and increasing articles in the media saying that all ground rents are bad. Now, that's certainly not the case, and don't just look at your lease and be concerned that you have a rent in there that doubles. If it's doubling maybe every 20, 25, 33 years, whatever it is, and it's only doubling for a set period of time, maybe 2, 3 or 4 reviews, for example, that may well still be a fine ground rent. And in fact, some of the mortgage lenders won't lend when there is a third party landlord if there isn't some form of ground rent in the lease, unless it's been extended under statute, because it means that the landlords have got more of an interest in that building. So I was checking the mortgage handbook a week or so ago and noted there was at least one of the main lenders, I think it was Barclays, that wouldn't lend where that was the case, when there wasn't a rent in that case. However, and Rick, maybe you can touch on this after this slide, but or at the end of the slide, but there are certainly some that are onerous, and there are therefore mortgage companies that won't now lend on these onerous rents now that they understand the implications of them. And my understanding is the generally perceived view, although it's not defined, is that any rent that is more than 0.1% of the capital value of the property is considered to be onerous. Rick, you can nod at me if you think that's right. No one else can see that, but I can. So yeah, he's nodding, so that's good. I've got my understanding fine. So you do need to be careful with those rents. And the other thing you need to watch with ground rents is where they are more than £250 outside of London or £1,000 within Greater London. And the reason for this is there is a provision when the rents are above those levels, there is a provision in the Housing Act that could arguably suggest that those leases are in fact assured tenancies as opposed to what you expect when you are buying a flat or you're buying the lease, i.e. a long lease. And if that's the case, if there are any rent arrears, then there is potential for the landlord to make a claim to in effect forfeit the lease on the basis that the rents haven't been paid. Now, I'm not aware of any cases where the landlord sought to argue this, but it is something that is in the market and that there is concern by. So it is coming up on conveyancing questions and queries that people then want to make sure that the leases are varied to change that. It's not actually always an issue, and in fact, you can put a clause. You could maybe potentially agree a clause that the landlord won't pursue it on that basis into the lease. But it is something that you certainly want to discuss with your landlord and see if you can agree a variation to your lease, either, as I say, to vary it so that the landlord won't be seeking to pursue this as if it was considered an assured tenancy, or you would look to change your ground rent down to one that is acceptable within the market. The latter, particularly if you have one of these bad onerous doubling ground rents. You will, though, probably have to pay to do that because the landlord will expect to be compensated unless that comes within one of these developers who are agreeing to change them in the first place. There are two ways to do that, either by the lease extensions that we've been talking about. So you extend your lease, and by virtue of extending your lease on a statutory basis, your ground rent becomes a peppercorn, or you reach an agreement with your landlord. You may not need to extend your lease because you may have a very long lease, in which case you can just enter into a deed of variation with your landlord if they agree to do so, and if you pay the premium that you agree between you. It's definitely something that I would say is coming up more and more frequently with our conveyancing teams. Before I move on to Rick, I would just talk about one other issue that I think people need to check to make sure before they put their property onto the market, and that is that what is said in your lease, what is demised in your lease, so what property is included within your lease is what you expect to be there, so everything that you use with the property. So if you have a parking space that you use with your flat or with your house, and you expect that to be granted by your lease, then that will need to be referred to in your lease. And if there's any areas like that, or any storage areas or garages or anything along those lines that you would expect to, or roof spaces, etc., that you are expecting that you use with the property, you should check that your lease reflects that. Because if it does not, then it is something else that's likely to come up in the conveyancing process and cause potential issues. Rick, was there anything else you wanted to add on that?
I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And you've got to make sure. I mean, I went to see a flat yesterday actually for a lease extension, and the lady pulled out her lease and she said, "Oh, here's my lease." The first thing I did was to look at the lease plan that was there. I walked around the flat and I realised that the layout of the flat was not the same layout that was in the lease plan. And when I asked her if she had a license for alterations, she didn't know that she had a license for alterations, and I don't think there is a license for alterations. And she went through her entire file from when she bought it. So I don't quite know how that transaction happened, but clearly she's got to sort that out. So she's going to have to get a license, because when she comes to sell, it's going to cause problems, because nobody's going to buy it without a license. But which kind of leads me on to just generally home improvements and licenses and alterations. And we're in a time now where some people might not want to put their properties on the market. They may want to see what happens and see when things pick up again, and they may think to launch it then. So they're saying, well, what can I do now to put myself in the best position when the market does come back? And one of the things is, well, let's look at what you've got. Can you add value to your apartment or your house? And can we make some alterations? And what we're finding at the moment is we've had quite a few requests for valuations, and I think I've got 4 ongoing where people are looking to buy into the common parts or go into the loft. I've got 2 of them where one is wanting to do a loft extension, so they're going outside of their demise and putting a bedroom and then some outside space because they don't have that at the moment, any outside space. And then I've got another one where they're looking to actually do the same, but it's rather than the loft, it's sort of a flat roof and they want to put another floor on. So it's really important that even if you don't do it, you get your planning in place, you get it, you get it ready. Because even simply having planning permission adds marketability to your property and adds value. But yeah, I mean, the sort of things that you might want to think about is reconfiguring the internal layout, buying in communal space. You may have a small bedroom next to the other side of that wall is a very large communal hallway. And actually having that within your flat will add significant value from going from a single bedroom or a small study to a double bedroom. So that's something that we do a lot. But the important thing is for the internal alterations, because obviously if you're buying something outside of your demise, you would expect to pay a premium, but you may also have to pay a premium if it's internal. And the reason is that it falls under 2 headings, if you like. One is a qualified clause, which means you can carry out work where the landlord can't unreasonably withhold consent, which means they can't even request a premium. But if you have an absolute prohibition on alterations, then you would expect to pay a premium. And that's where we can help, when we can look at the added value and looking at the cost of the works, and there will be then some negotiations that between the lessee's valuer and the freeholder's valuer. And then what's called a Section 5 notice under the Landlord and Tenant 1987 Act will need to be served, and somebody like Lee would serve that notice or be involved in that notice. But perhaps Lee, you can just talk a little bit more on how that works. But I'm told it's quite complicated, so you may not want to go into too much. And it's not the most well drafted of legislations. But over to you, Lee.
Thanks, Rick. Just to touch on that, that's you get involved in the Section 5 notices if you're changing if the freeholder's transferring part of the property to someone else, and the building qualifies. So if there's a building with more than 2 flats in it, and the freeholder wants to sell part of the common parts off, then they would have to offer that to all the freeholders, all the leaseholders in the building in the first place. Or it works the same way if they're looking to sell their freehold. They would normally have to offer it first, unless they're exempt from doing so, to the leaseholders, and that's the whole.
I think so just picking up on that. So it's not when it's internal works, it's when it's external work. So outside of the demise, that's when the Section 5 notices are served. So it's additional land.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So that's great. But so I think what we've done is go through quite a few different options that people can do to their leasehold. In the case of the last one, not just leasehold, but also any freehold property. Obviously, planning applications and extensions work for those as well. But there's certainly lots of different options that people should look at in order to see what they can do to improve the marketability and saleability of their property. But also generally, even if they're not looking to sell, all of these things can improve the value of their assets, and that's never a bad thing to look at, particularly if it's a good time in which to sort that out, because it may be slightly cheaper to do that if the market's uncertain. Before we go, though, that we do have a few questions that were submitted to us at the end, but before we do that, I just wanted to touch on where the leasehold reform is at the moment, because there's a whole push by both the government and the Law Commission to look at leasehold law generally, And we've been looking at, or they've been looking at this for many years, because there's, as we've discussed, there's lots of different statutory rights allowed for leaseholders, but they're not all perfectly drafted, and they're relatively complicated, and all the different rights we were looking at today have all got slightly different pieces or parts of the legislation which make it quite confusing for leaseholders to be able to follow, as well as for landlords to make sure that they're protecting themselves as well, and to make sure that they're getting the right price for something where they're going to have to lose something or grant something to their leaseholders. So there's been a really big push, particularly since the ground rent scandals that we've seen in the last 5-10 years, to try and make leasehold a lot simpler and understandable to everyone, really. There is also this whole push to see whether leasehold is the right way to own property in this country. Obviously, it's been here for hundreds of years, so a change to that system is not going to be straightforward, but there is certainly a push for people to look at something called common hold. But just to give you a brief idea of where we've got to, in 2017, the government proposed reform following the inbox of many MPs being filled significantly with these sorts of issues. After that, it moved on to the Law Commission deciding, following that consultation, to include leasehold reform, so anything to do with leasehold property, into their 13th programme of law reform. And since then, we've seen a huge number of consultations on this area. We've had one government consultation and 3 further Law Commission consultations. So this isn't something that's moving fast, but there's certainly political will to make some changes to this area of law. As a result, for the last couple of years, we've often had people saying to us, you know, should we hold on? What's going to happen to the leases? Should we wait before we do anything? Is it going to get cheaper for leaseholders? And I think it's fair to say that a significant part of what the government wants to do is to look at this area of law completely, try and make it work better. And one of the questions that the Law Commission were asked to look into is how to tackle the leasehold issue, how to tackle the ground rent issue, and how to make it cheaper, fairer, faster and cheaper for leaseholders. So there is certainly a push to move this more in favour of leaseholders. But the issue is there is so much for them to look through and for them to work through. I think it's 3 or 4 different pieces of legislation plus the amendments that they need to look at. And what they're looking at doing is a wholesale change to some extent. However, following the government's consultation, which looked at banning leasehold houses, reducing ground rents, making it actually more transparent and fairer for those owning freeholds to challenge any estate service charges, and also how to improve the selling of leasehold property, because that is also an issue. It takes significantly longer to deal with a leasehold property on a conveyance than it does with the freehold one, because you have to get information from all the other people involved. They did say in June 2019, after that, the government published their response in October 2018, and then in June 2019 they were talking about having draft legislation or draft bills coming out soon. That was expected by June of this year, but we are now past, or I suppose, spring of this year. We're now past spring of this year, and there's no sign of any such draft bill coming out. And then looking back at the Law Commission consultations, there were 3 main consultations that they issued in the last 18 months or so. One was looking at the whole process of extending your leases and buying your freehold of flats and houses, and seeing whether that should be combined together in one piece of legislation. They looked at the right to manage process, or the RTM process, which we haven't discussed today, but it's a way of the leaseholders getting together to take over the obligations of managing their building, but without buying the freehold. It's another process that leaseholders like to look into when the management of the building or the estate isn't working particularly well, or they want to have a better say in it. And the third one is looking at this common hold situation and whether common hold could work rather than leasehold. On all of these, on the lease extension and the enfranchisement one, the Law Commission have put a report to the government setting out some suggested ways of making lease extensions and enfranchisement cheaper, but they've left that's been left with the government to decide how they want to pursue that. And they're certainly, from the proposals that we've seen, they're certainly not wiping out any form of compensation to landlords, and they've also wiped away any suggestion that it should be a simple calculation of paying 10 times the ground rent for a lease extension, which was one of the options at one point. So we're not going to be dramatically different from where we are now, but we would expect the government at some point to come out with some suggestion as to making these processes cheaper. The problem is, along with the government draft bill that we're meant to be seeing in spring 2020, we were also expecting response from the Law Commission to the rest of those consultations also by spring 2020. And again, we haven't heard any more on that at all. Obviously, Brexit at the time, well, all of last year, we were expecting there to be some delay because of the Brexit negotiations, but obviously the whole situation with COVID has completely thrown all of that out of sync as well. So I don't think that we're likely to see anything from the rumours that I've heard before autumn, maybe later towards the end of the year. But that still won't be legislation, and that still won't actually be changing anything. So we're still, I think, some way off of any proper changes to any of this law. And so for the reasons that we're discussing today, and the reasons that we've already, that we've set out, we don't necessarily think, unless you've got, a really long lease and you really haven't got an issue with your ground rent, we don't think it would be worth holding out, because those changes in the law certainly aren't imminent. The only other thing that I'm just going to add is that in March 2019, the government did try and deal with some of these ground rent issues and published a new industry pledge, where around 62 developers and agents have signed up to the pledge, setting out an intention to help leaseholders with onerous ground rents. So there is a push by the sector as a whole to make sure that people that do have difficult ground rents that aren't marketable, to help sort them. So that leads into exactly what we were saying about looking to change your leases, and that people are likely to be amenable to it. I think just to conclude on that before we go on to some questions, if that's okay, Rick, but feel free to add in after my slight roundup. I think
no, that's fine. I mean, I think one of the things that I would add is when there were certainly people back in 2017 that we were speaking to, and the uncertainty then about what changes were going to be made, they decided to hold off. But actually, we're now 3 years on, potentially another 2 or 3, I don't know, into action. If you've got a meaningful short, sort of anywhere between 20 and 80 years, then that just by waiting, you've paid more. You're going to be paying more for your lease extension. That's today, and then we don't know what's going to happen anyway. There may be minor changes to how the valuation process works. The answer is we don't know. But the other honest answer that I would give to those that wait is that since the beginning of my career, those that have waited have always paid more for whatever reason, whatever changes are put in place. The premiums for lease extensions just get more expensive. So and that's the only thing that I can add on that. And we don't know what changes they're going to make. But what you can do is you can protect yourself to make sure you don't pay more. In terms of the long lease value, you'll get the benefit of it then anyway. So there's certainly no loss. But you could end up paying significantly more the longer you wait. And particularly in this sort of period that we have now, it could just be a short-lived pause. It could be in 3 months' time the market picks up. Again, we don't know. But certainly with this, with these claims that are made for lease extensions and the like, it's all about the valuation date and what is somebody willing to pay at the valuation date. Now, clearly, somebody with a valuation date of April is going to be very different to somebody with a valuation date of February, and you would expect a discount in that market value because of the uncertainty. So I think my view is that there's a window of an opportunity. How big that window is, we don't know, and we certainly know that that window is open now. Back to you, Lee.
Thanks, Rick. I think that I just wanted to pick up on a couple of the questions that we were sent through by people listening to the webinar. So the first of these was that someone owns a medical practice property in the basement of a residential building, and they wanted to extend their lease and purchase a share in the freehold. They asked whether there were impositions as to what they have constitutes a medical practice, and would that be considered a business? All I can say to that is it very much depends on what is in the lease and how the building is constructed. So both of those things we'd really need to look at. It is possible that with medical practices, sometimes they are, depending on what other property may be with them, sometimes they are could be considered within the residential side because of other bits of property with it and the way the lease is drafted. But you may well have an issue that you aren't a qualifying tenant if you are a commercial tenant. But as I say, we're very happy to be contacted to look at these in more detail. One of the Rick, I'm not going to come back to you on that one because I think it's more of a legal one. The next question, was that right, Nick? Sorry.
Yeah, no, I'm happy with that.
Fine. The second question was about, and there were some people who, the question is, we have an RTM, so they have a right to manage the building, which I mentioned just briefly before, so that they don't own the freehold, but they do have the right to take over the majority of the management of the building. That's leaseholders that have got together to do that. It's a similar process. It's another statutory process similar to that of an enfranchisement, but you don't actually buy the freehold, so the freeholder stays involved. So the question in this case was, what are the steps needed to acquire the freehold? And the answer is, although the leaseholders already have this right to manage the building, which is great because they're already set up and have that working process so that they know how each other works and that they know that they can deal with the management of the building. However, they would still have to get together and follow the whole process for buying the freehold in the same way as anyone would if they were starting from scratch. They would normally set up a new company to do it, get a new valuation, and start the process in the way that we discussed earlier. So although the right to manage that's already in place will have some advantages of making it work, actually the process would have to start from the beginning. One of the other questions, Rick, you can come back after if there's anything you wanted to come back on that.
No,
otherwise I think that's fine.
Question.
The other question we've been asked is, what are the additional costs incurred for lease extensions? So you've got the cost that Rick's gone through, the whole process of setting out how the premium is calculated for buying a lease extension. The other costs are the leaseholder's own legal and valuation fees, and also the landlord's legal and valuation fees, which I discussed earlier. And also, if the lease extension were to cost more than £40,000, then there may well be STLT payable in the usual way when you're buying a property over that value, or at least needs to be considered at that rate.
If I can just add to that, what I did have a client who at the beginning of the process was concerned about the costs, and obviously they are unknown until we start the negotiations. But this particular person was liable to pay for the negotiation fees on behalf of the landlord, and also the landlord's costs for the tribunal. But I just wanted to say that you only bear your own costs for negotiations and your own costs for the tribunal. So I think it's important just to set that out.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to repeat, I think you cut out a little bit. Yeah, absolutely, Rick. Thank you. I think you cut out a little bit from my end. So I'm not. It was that you only pay the valuation cost of the landlord. You don't pay the negotiation cost of the landlord. Yeah, absolutely correct. You are on that, as you should be, because I know you do these lots. There's one last question, which is for you. How much can a property value appreciate by above the lease cost? I think you've discussed that a fair amount, but if there's anything you want to add, then feel free to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was covered earlier. I mean, I think the important thing to think about is that if you're buying a short lease, you know, we can accurately estimate how much it's going to cost, but it is really a likely premium that you're going to pay, and it's not the actual premium that you're going to pay. So there's a little bit of an uncertainty there, and there's time, and there's hassle, and then there are costs, and so if you remove all of those issues and you have your extended lease once it's brought to the market, all of those points just help make it more marketable, because people don't have to have that hassle, they don't have to have that risk and that uncertainty. And if they wouldn't just pay the difference between the extended lease premium and the actual extended lease value. So there's definitely something in there to be gained, and it depends on where your property is and what is buying it. But nobody would just deduct that cost from the extended lease value to get to your short lease value. I know I certainly wouldn't. One point I'd just like to touch on as well that I've been asked about is statutory and voluntary claims. It's really important that the statutory claims are made over and above voluntary claims where possible. And I say where possible because obviously there are occasions where you know the landlord and they are honourable. Most of them maybe not so, but I mean they're out to get as much as they can get. You're out to pay as little as you can pay. So there's going to be tension over the premium. Now, what I've seen a few examples over the years where voluntary lease extensions have taken a significant period of time, and then when it's come to it, the landlord has said, well, actually, I've changed my mind, I don't want to do it. And that time has cost, the cost of that time is the increase in the premium. So it's really important to serve the notice, get that valuation date fixed, the lease doesn't get any shorter, everything freezes, and you have the statutory protection the legislation sets out. So, you know, once you've started the process, you can end it or you can withdraw it. You can't have anybody messing you about, and I think that's really important. And you know, I think one has to be careful, particularly where there's a purchase.
Great. I'm going to, and this was something I'm going to change that slightly. I think there's probably more scrupulous than unscrupulous landlords, isn't it, Rick? That we certainly come across, even if the perception may be the other way around. But certainly we act for many that are very scrupulous and act very fairly. And normally, I think there is this is one of the things we come up with the leasing, with dealing with leasehold and freehold property all the time, is that there's always a perception that the landlord's out to be difficult, but it's not always the case, I have to say. No, so just to conclude, I think, you know, we are still in uncertain times, but there are clearly ways that you can add lots of value to your property, and we hope we've set some out here for you today. There are always going to be questions that we haven't answered when you look at specific properties, for example, and Rick and I are both very happy to be contacted, and if I can move on to the slide, you'll get our contact details again. There we go. We're very happy to be contacted if anyone wants to discuss any of their particular issues through, and if there's anything we can do to help them, we'd be very happy to do so. And I think time will tell to some extent where the market goes. Well, clearly we'll tell where it's going to go, and we'll have to look back on this time and see what effect it did have on values. But it is interesting times, but hopefully this has assisted you on your way in making some decisions. The only other thing I would just say to add is that we do have on the Irwin Mitchell website a hub where you'll find lots of these different sorts of discussions that we've been having during the coronavirus lockdown, covering all things sort of legal or financial, and hopefully they can help you with other issues as well. If you do have any other suggestions for other events that you may find useful during this period, or things which have changed, or you want some information on, then please feel free to email us at Irwin Mitchell, and we will look to see what other events we can put on, but there are regular events coming on. And finally, just to thank you, Rick, for joining us and for giving us your input into where you feel the market is and how we can add with value to people's properties.
Thank you.
Pleasure. And that's it from us, but feel free to contact us if you have any questions.